So welcome everyone to the Policy McCombs. We're having a slightly different topic than usually. However, I don't think of a better example of what we try to bring to our community, not only through our events, but through our teaching and research projects that we support. That is a very rigorous combination of data and thinking carefully about trade-offs in assessing public policies. And Emily's work, I guess, is like one of the best examples of that in a topic that maybe we don't expect, but of course, can use a lot of good work on data-driven and economic thinking. So it's a pleasure to have Emily here today. Just for a matter of logistics, we're recording this, so if you have questions, we're gonna have questions in the end, so just wait for the mic. We're gonna pass the mic around. It's not for sound here, just for recording purposes. Emily, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you guys for coming, and thank you, Carlos, for organizing, and thank you to some of you for coming to a second talk today. Yay. Okay. All right. So I want to start by having you imagine that you are a new parent. And the main thing for those of you who don't have kids for this example is to think that you are very tired. And so you're in bed with your 3-week-old baby. He just finished eating. He's sort of asleep. He's there. And you know that if you just sort of like kind of sidle down and put it down next to you, that the baby would stay asleep, and then you could go to sleep, and then you would feel like less of a train wreck in the morning. But you also are dimly aware that there is some stuff about how you're not supposed to sleep in the bed with the baby, and there is a bassinet crib. You're supposed to put the baby, and they kind of remember that. So you wonder, like, well, how big a deal is that really? So you might ask your partner, but that guy is asleep next to you. Thanks very much. Whose idea was this one? So you get on your phone, and you start Googling around and talking to people. And when you do that, you kind of find that, fortunately, the internet is available to answer your question. And there are 2 answers. There are some people who are like, absolutely, it's totally fine to have your baby sleep next to you. In fact, it's beyond that. If you don't do that, your baby will never be attached to you or love you. So in fact, the last 3 weeks, you've been doing it totally wrong. You gotta sleep next to it. That's the only way to form a stable attachment with your kid. Then on the other side, the people who say, if you do this even one time, your baby will die for sure. Feels like that they kind of can't both be true. But it is very hard in the moment, in 3 o'clock in the morning, to figure out what is the right one. So maybe you put it in the bassinet, or maybe you don't. Probably you put it down, it kind of wakes up, and then you sort of start over again. So in the light of day, one might think about trying to get to the bottom of this a bit more rigorously, not with like Facebook, but with some more reputable sources. But you might still, when you try to dig deeper into the research, you might still find that it is very difficult to get the answer to the question. So when you get into the research, you would not find the kind of polarized views that you get on Facebook. The research is more nuanced than that. But it would be very difficult to figure out exactly what is the answer to the question, how risky is it to do this? There are definitely pieces of the research that would tell you, in fact, no, it's not risky to sleep in the bed with your baby, or if you do it right, it's not risky. And then there would be pieces of the research and pieces of these sort of official recommendations that would tell you, no, actually it is really risky. There is disagreement among academic papers. There is disagreement among experts. So this talk is kind of mostly about some of the data in this book. And when I think about what is the work of this book and of my earlier book, which was sort of similar approach to pregnancy, I think the work is really about saying, how can we sort through that evidence, which doesn't all say the same thing? And how can we get to what is the best evidence say, or what does the totality of the evidence say, in a way that is, accessible and understandable, and actually tries to help us make good decisions in the space on parenting. And so I wanted to talk a little bit today about just this question of sort of how do we think about what good evidence is, and how do I grapple with sort of looking at pieces of the data and thinking about both what is the best piece of evidence on it, what is the problem with some of the other evidence, and how can we kind of bring that together. So I'm going to end up sort of talking about two examples, but I'm going to spend a lot of time on breastfeeding. And the question of whether breast milk is magic. Is it magic? If you are a new parent, it is particularly new mom. It is certainly you would be forgiven for thinking the answer is yes. There is a tremendous amount of messaging around the idea that breastfeeding your kid is not just a way to kind of contribute positively to their life, but the way. And so when I was working on the book, I compiled this categorized list of benefits that I have seen cited in various locations for the things that are good about breastfeeding. So first, there are some benefits to your baby in the short term. Some of them are around fewer illnesses, lower risk of some very serious complications. Then there are some long-term benefits also to your child. So less diabetes, juvenile arthritis, childhood cancer, meningitis, pneumonia, urinary tract infections, Crohn's disease, obesity, allergies, asthma. There are some long-term cognitive benefits. Obviously, they will be smarter. And then you should not ignore the benefits to yourself, like the free birth control, the fact that you'll be skinny, your baby will love you more, you'll be rich, you're not going to be very stressed out, you're sleeping all the time, form better friendships. I mean, who can ignore the need for your friends? Lower risk of cancer, lower risk of postpartum depression, and then there's the methane argument. Cows produce methane. That's just fact about the world. So this is a large number of things, and this is kind of the picture that you get. The question is sort of why do we think we know these things? What is the kind of evidence that we get? What is the kind of evidence that we bring to bear on this? And I think before I get into what is the evidence we actually bring to bear on this, it is worth thinking about sort of what would be the ideal evidence. So let's think about something like the links between breastfeeding and obesity in kids. So let's say my goal is to understand the relationship between breastfeeding and obesity in 12-year-olds. So what would you want to do to do that? Well, what you'd want to do is, I think, some kind of randomized controlled trial. That would be sort of our gold standard type evidence. So you'd want a lot of people, very large sample of people, and half of them you want to tell them to breastfeed their kid, and half of them you tell them not to breastfeed their kid. And then you follow them over time. And when their kid is 10, you see whether they are overweight or not. And that is the outcome that you report. If you were interested in adult obesity, I guess you'd have to follow them sort of even longer. If you think about what's hard about a study like that, and we're not going to have a lot of studies like that. You think about it's kind of should be obvious why. One thing is you can't really make people do stuff. Okay, so that's actually not insurmountable. So there are randomized trials of breastfeeding, and they typically work with what we call an encouragement design. So you tell some people that maybe you're more aggressive about your breastfeeding promotion with some people than others, or you provide them with more support in various ways. So you could imagine doing that, although it's not going to be as good as forcing people because you're not going to get sort of perfect compliance. So that's kind of one problem. But then the other problem is just it's hard to follow people. It's like that's an expensive study, right? So you sort of think about the practical details of like, well, what if they move? How will I find them? What if they don't want to talk to me 10 years later? Like, all this other kind of stuff that's gonna go on. That's just a very, very hard thing. A very, very hard thing to do. So we want to have that in our mind as kind of that's like the gold standard. The question is, how close are we going to be able to get to that with the approaches that we actually have access to? So I want to talk about one example, which is the link between breastfeeding and IQ. And I want to talk about a couple of different papers. So here's an example of a paper on the relationship between breastfeeding and sort of child IQ, cognitive development, sort of broadly. So this is a paper from 2001 in a journal called the Archives of Diseases of Childhood, called Breastfeeding and Cognitive Development at age 1 and 5 years. This is, I just want to be clear, representative of a very large number of papers, which have this kind of basic structure. So here's what this paper does. This paper's run in Sweden, and they have about 350 kids. And they they measure something about the cognitive outcomes for the kids at 1 and 5. And they ask their moms They survey their moms about their breastfeeding behavior. And they divide the sample into two groups, kids who are breastfed for less than 3 months and kids who are breastfed for more than 6 months. I don't actually know what they do with the people in the middle. It's not important for this example. And so those are their two groups. And then they just, the first step is they just compare the test scores for these two groups. So here on the y-axis they score these kids on development, and they have a low. You can be low developing. That's their outcome is like, do you have a low development score? And at both of these ages, what they see is the kids who are not breastfed are much more likely to have this low development score. And you read these as odds. So this is about 3.2 times as likely to have a low development score at age 13 months and kind of comparable at age 5. So this is representative of a very, very large share of the papers in this space, which will show you that kids who are breastfed do better than kids who do not on these kind of cognitive metrics. What's the problem? So the problem is that the moms who choose to breastfeed are also very different than the moms who do not choose to breastfeed. And that's even true in Sweden. I mean, it's going to be, forget about how true it is in America. It's even true in the sort of Swedish context. The moms who breastfeed tend to be higher income. They tend to be more educated. They have other kinds of resources. Those resources are associated with improved cognitive development. So it is very difficult to know whether it is the breastfeeding or the other resources that drive this relationship. So let me pause and say it's a very interesting secondary question is why is that? Because that has actually not always been true. I mean, it's certainly not true in the very vast historical realm, because there's a time at which everyone was fed with breast milk. But even if you sort of look over the last 100 years, kind of breastfeeding rates decline in general. They're actually pretty even across socioeconomic groups in the sort of period before 1970, and they just sort of decline into the 1970s. And so if you look at data from kind of the early 1970s, the share of women who are initiating breastfeeding, who are ever breastfeeding in the US is like 20%. So it's really, really low. And then something happens in the mid-70s, I think we totally understand, but there's then a sort of just a turn up of the series, and we get a big increase in breastfeeding rates that more or less continues with some plateauing from the 70s till now. So actually at the moment, the breastfeeding rates in the US, initiation of breastfeeding is like at 80 to 90%. So it's really, really high. It's like as high as it's kind of been over a very, very long share of time. That increase in the 1970s, at least initially, is very strongly concentrated in like women with more education and more income. And I think that is not why that is not well understood. I think part of it is, they're maybe more responsive to public health messaging. There may be other factors there. But that change, that sort of evolution over that period has been very important in sort of driving some of the demographic patterns we see in the breastfeeding data today. So if you are a person who does public health research, you are aware of this problem, that you can't really compare these two groups because they have these other differences, but we have approaches to addressing those differences, controlling for them. And so in this paper, like many of these papers, they are able to control for differences in education or income, a few demographics. So here is the same graph, and now I've added a series for what you see when you add in controls. And this paper has a lot of problems. One of them is that they add controls one at a time, but never all together. And we can, those of you who are more like, that's not ideal. But at any rate, this is what happens when they add their most extreme control. And so what you see there is that the sort of differences across the groups go down a lot. They're actually still quite significant. And if you sort of looked at this and you said, well, how important is that in terms of magnitude? The kids who are not breastfed, or in this case are breastfed for less time, are almost twice as likely to have these low development scores. So I think it's a real, sizable effect, even if it's smaller. So this paper kind of stops there. And they're like, okay, well, our uncontrolled comparison was too extreme, but don't worry, these effects still maintain if we put in controls for observables, and so we should be fine. The question is that enough? So are those controls that they see, are those sufficient? Right? Is it possible that there are other features of women which are not the 2 categories of education and 3 categories of income that they see in the data? Or is it possible that there are other differences across moms? Of course, there are other differences across moms. Question is it possible that those are important in driving these differences even in the controlled regression? Okay? And in fact, in my view, although this is sort of betraying a little bit of the kinds of things that I work on in my academic work, in my view, the fact that this coefficient is so sensitive to the inclusion of controls, that it changes so much when you add in these simple controls, that in and of itself, I think, should give us some pause and some concern about the possibility that maybe there may be other things that matter. So you adjust a little bit for a few of the differences across moms. It makes a huge difference in your effect. It makes me more worried that maybe there are some things that we don't see, and that those might also matter for these effects. Okay, so that alone, then I've left you here. I'm like, okay, here's this picture. I'm still worried about other stuff. So what to do? And in order to make some progress, we need better methods. We need to do something that is kind of better than just comparing these people and adjusting for education. So in the data on breastfeeding in particular, there's kind of 2 things that people do that I think are better. So one is that actually there is one randomized control trial of breastfeeding where they encourage some moms to breastfeed more aggressively than they encourage others, and they see differences in breastfeeding uptake rates, and they can compare the outcomes for kids in that data. When you do that and you look at the results that study finds on breastfeeding on IQ, you find that that it suggests that there aren't really significant effects on IQ from breastfeeding. But that study is run in the 1990s in Belarus. And so a reasonable complaint is that, well, maybe that is not really representative of what we would see here. And there are a lot of differences between that kind of study and these other studies that the other kind of population we'd be interested in. So that maybe alone, that's, even though it's the gold standard randomized blah, 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 maybe it's kind of not enough. So the other thing that people have done is to say, well, is there a way that we can improve the controls that we're using in a setting like this? So let me give you an example then of a paper that is able to do that. So this is a paper from the British Medical Journal, and about contemporaneous, a few years later than the one I showed, I showed before. And so what this paper does is that it has, well, this paper has a few innovations over the other paper. One is that the sample is much bigger. That's always kind of nice, but it's probably not the most relevant feature of this. But in this bigger sample, they see the same kinds of things that the other study sees. So they see whether the kid was breastfed, and they see the test scores for the kid. So that's kind of the basic stuff you need. They see some basic demographics for the mom. And they see 2 other things. First, they actually see the mom's test scores. So they see the same kind of IQ test for mom that they see for the kids. So if one of your concerns in this other study was, well, you see the mom's education, but you don't see her IQ, well, this is gonna fix that with better data. The second thing, the last thing they do is they actually see multiple kids in the same family. So they see 2 kids, same mom, one of them is breastfed and one of them is not. And that's gonna let us do sort of the last thing and say, what if you literally had the same mom and the only thing that was different, it's not gonna be the only thing that was different, but the breastfeeding is different, but at least you're having the same mom. What is very good about this paper as well is that you can actually, unlike the randomized trial, you can actually do exactly the same initial analysis that you could do in the other paper. So you can show, if I were to do the kind of naive basic control approach to this, what would I see in these data? So here's the first piece of this evidence. So here the y-axis is just the impact on IQ, scaled in IQ points. So when they have no other controls, when they just compare kids who are breastfed to kids who are not, maybe just age controls, you see like a 4.5 IQ point difference across the two groups. Okay. Here's what happens to that difference is when you put in some adjustment for demographics. So it goes down a lot, just like the other one. And but that's actually still significant. It's about 2 IQ points. Sort of 1.5, and we could argue whether we care about 1.5 IQ points, but people seem to care a lot about their kids' IQ, so fine. And so this is a statistically significant result. And remember, this is where the other paper kind of stops. Here's what happens when you put in controls for mom's IQ. Now we're down to about 0.5 IQ point, actually still statistically significant, at least some of their specifications, although, admittedly pretty small. And here's what happens when you adjust for who the mom is. So it's actually 0.02 IQ points, and I hope none of us are doing things for our children to get them 0.02 IQ points. That would be a mistake. And so here, what I really like about this study and the sort of other sets of studies in this space of kind of sibling fixed effects, better controls, is that you can really see like why these controls matter. You can sort of visualize the controls mattering. So it's different from just saying, well, your study said there was an effect, my study said there was no effect. I guess really it could be anything. And it's really saying, no, the reason that our study said different things was because when I did your study, it also said there was an effect, but your study is problematic. When I do a better thing, then we get to more of a convincing effect. So this is an issue this is a sort of comparable issue comes up with all of the breastfeeding literature. So what I do in the book is I really sort of try to think pretty carefully about all of the different kind of pieces of evidence about breastfeeding, and I kind of come down to kind of a much more limited list in the end of things where there are some demonstrated benefits. So I want to be clear, the message of the book is actually not that there are no benefits to breastfeeding. I think there are things in the data which do have pretty strong support. For example, better digestive health for babies kind of in the first year. So babies, I think, do have an easier time digesting breast milk than formula, particularly early on. That's probably also linked to this, which is a very serious premature baby complication. And I think maybe there's some evidence on ear infections. This is sort of an interesting piece of the book where the randomized data is not super compelling, but actually the sibling fixed effect kind of data is more convincing, and there's more of a mechanistic reason. So the data analysis there is a bit more subtle. There actually is some evidence of lower breast cancer risk for mom, which is kind of an interesting piece of the puzzle, given how little that gets discussed. Yeah, I thought we were doing questions. Do we know why? Yeah, there's some. So I think part of what makes this evidence more convincing is that there is a mechanism about changes in the cell tissue, which you can see in sort of more basic science analyses, which seems to be linked to this. So I think there's, again, this is not from randomized data, so it's a little, it's always a little smushy, but I think it also there is some reason to think that might be true. Some of the message of this book is to kind of look at the data and think then about sort of what is going to work for you inside thinking about not only the data but also the broader picture. So for something like breastfeeding, yes, breast is best. Okay, people say breast is best. Yeah, I guess it's best. I mean, I don't know, it has some benefits. It's best. But when you say breast is best like that, and when we tell moms like breast is best, it comes out like it's best. It's the most best, the bestest of the best possible things. And the sort of message there makes it very hard if people don't want to do this or it doesn't work. And I think it ignores the sort of piece of this which is about kind of individual autonomy. So a lot of the message of the book is about trying to make choices that work for you and that kind of take into account the preferences that you have in your family and the constraints you have and other things that matter, not just like approaching parenting as a kind of effort to maximize your baby's IQ at all costs for yourself, which is sometimes what it seems like.
I should wait until I have my microphone so it's recording. So.
Okay, fine, great. Okay, so that's So that's what I wanted to say about breastfeeding. And I think the one thing people sometimes ask is like, okay, well, how am I supposed to like use this information? Like that's such a nice analysis, thank you, of this particular thing. But like now, like I open the newspaper and there's like a new thing that says, you know, breastfeeding affects this thing, affects this other thing. How do I know if this study is any good? And I think that that's a sort of tricky. That's a tricky question. I think one thing to interrogate always in those places, which is why I started with like what's the ideal data, is, you know, how far is this new study from the ideal data? Is it close to randomized? How good are the controls? How big is the study? How worried are you that there are big differences across the groups, or we have very limited data about people, or the way that we measure breastfeeding is very poor? You know, if it's a study that takes 35, 40-year-old men and asks them whether they were breastfed and then compares something about them, that's not a very good study because they don't know whether they were breastfed because they're old. And so those are the kind of things we want to be sort of cautious about. All right. So then I wanted to talk about a second example, which I think is sort of the flip side of actually like when does science work well? And so it's about peanuts and the question of peanut exposure. So one of the big questions in early parenting, whatever, is about food. So there's a lot of questions about what kinds of food you should give your kids. And one of the pieces of advice that parents have sort of historically gotten, and I will say historically, I mean I got this advice when my daughter was born, and she's 8, so it's not like the distant historical past. So the advice that people were given was not to expose your kids to allergens when they were little. So to wait for, there are some kinds of highly allergenic foods. Peanuts is one, but also other kinds of nuts, milk, soy, eggs, that you should avoid those, and particularly you should avoid peanuts until your kid is much older. So people got the advice to wait until the kid is a year, even 2 years, before exposing them to peanuts, kind of on both the idea that it would be less likely, they would then be less likely to be allergic, and also if they were allergic, they would be older, and so then it would somehow be easier to deal with the consequences of that in some way. So that was the advice that people were given. I think people typically sort of took. So at some point, this guy, last author, in these science papers, like the last author is the important person, not the first author. Okay, so this guy, Gideon Lack, is an important guy. This guy is working in the UK, and he has this idea, I think basically based on conversations with his friends in Israel. So he has some friends in Israel, and they're presumably, well, okay, I'll tell you how I envision this going, which is I envision that he is complaining to his friends in Israel that he cannot send peanut butter sandwiches to his kids' school for their lunch because everyone is allergic to peanuts, because it's driving me out of my mind. And then his friends are like, oh, we don't have any of that problem here. But I don't know how he got this idea. Anyway, he's got this idea that basically that there's something sort of importantly different about Israel and the UK in the degree of peanut allergies. And so they go and they collect some data. So they basically collect some like prevalence data on the degree of peanut allergies for kids in Israel. And then they collect comparable prevalence data on the degree of peanut allergies for kids in the UK. They limit it to Jewish kids, so you have a sort of similar genetic space, I guess. And what they find is that the prevalence of peanut allergy in Israel versus the UK is very different. So in fact, here are some graphs for all kids and then for kids in elementary school of how much more likely the kids in the UK are than the kids in Israel to be allergic to peanuts. And these numbers are again excess risks. So the primary school kids in the UK are like 17 times as likely to be allergic to have a diagnosed peanut allergy than the kids in Israel. Then they put in some controls, and just like in the breastfeeding case, the sort of risk of this the sort of differences go down. They put in some kind of basic controls for other kinds of health stuff. In the paper, they go beyond just putting up these pictures and comparing the prevalences. They then want you to believe their story for why this is. And their story is this peanut snack called bamba, which is this Israeli puffed peanut snack that little kids are given. So it's like a very common early food in Israel is this peanut snack bamba. And so their idea is that basically because kids are getting this peanut snack early on, that's why they're not allergic to peanuts. So that, okay, that kind of hangs together. But as a piece of sort of social science, it's this is this is even worse. I mean, I've been picking on something where at least we're comparing people in the same location whose mothers made different choices. Now you're trying to tell me all the difference between Israel and the UK are because of a snack called Bamba. That's what you want me to think. That's what you want me to believe. But what's really great about this story is actually this guy did not stop there. So he could have stopped there and just had this sort of interesting fact about Bamba. But they actually did a large randomized control trial of this idea of early exposure. So they take this population of kids, and they actually, this is a really well designed trial. So they take a population of kids, they limit to kids who are at high risk in general for allergies. So they basically take kids whose siblings have an allergy or some kind of eczema issue because they need power. So you want, in a study like this, you want to be able to detect statistically significant effects without a huge sample size. So you got to have a lot of people become allergic to peanuts. So you need a population that's kind of predisposed to peanut allergies. And this sample is a super simple RCT approach. You take half the kids and you tell their parents, expose them to peanuts at 4 months, and they give them, probably they gave them Bamba. They give them something to expose so their kids can try peanuts early on, and then the other group, they tell them not to do it. And they actually do yet a further thing within their study, which is that they divide the kids into kids who show some reactivity to peanuts already at 3 months and some kids who don't. There are some kids where when you do a skin prick test at 3 months, it looks like they're already kind of sensitive to peanuts. And then there are some kids who don't. So they have a high allergy risk and a low allergy risk group, and then they have overall, and they look at these outcomes. So here is the ultimate peanut allergy prevalence numbers. So here is the whole cohort of kids. So in the kids who are told to avoid peanuts, 18% of them develop a peanut allergy. Again, this is a pretty high risk sample. In the group that's told to consume peanuts, early 3% of them develop a peanut allergy. In the high allergy risk group, a third of the kids, more than a third of the kids who are avoiding peanuts get a peanut allergy, only 10% of those who consume. And in the low allergy risk, it's 13 and 2. In some ways, I think the most striking numerical difference in this table, which is in this picture, which is full of striking numerical differences, is that this number is higher than this number. So that means we took some kids who already appear to be allergic to peanuts, and we exposed them to peanuts, and they were less likely to ultimately develop an allergy than kids who showed no allergy, whose parents were told to avoid peanuts. Right? So that's a pretty big difference. And I want to be clear, in pediatrics, in the stuff that I talk about in this book, the idea that you would have effects of this size is totally unheard of. Okay, everything else is maybe it's a little bit here. It's even the stuff that's convincing, it's well, it's really not that important. Don't get your panties in a bunch on it. This is actually super important, super, super big effects. Of the size that if people actually change their behavior to expose their kids to peanuts early on, this would have huge effects on the population level prevalence of these allergies. So I will say, to the credit of the people who make these kind of policies, the recommendations on this change really fast. So even by the time, this came out in February 2015, my son is born in March 2015, I actually got the advice to expose him to peanuts early, even though that had been a month. And I think my pediatrician is a little bit ahead of the curve. But within the sort of couple years after this, there have been sort of big changes in what we sort of recommend that people do. And so it is now the case that people are sort of told to expose their kids to peanuts, very early on. And lest you worry that the market, I'm an economist, lest you worry the market did not respond to this, there are many startups which will sell you powdered peanuts and other items so you can expose your kids to allergens early on using an expensive approach rather than just giving them peanut butter, which is also fine. So I want to sort of end on what I think is sort of reflecting a little bit on this set of data, and so I think on the one hand it's really great that we actually got this evidence and that now we know the truth and that this guy actually went out and did the randomized control trial, and that's awesome, and that's how we think science should work, and that's so great. But I do think it's worth asking the question, where did we come up with this first piece of advice? So at some point, somebody decided to make some public health advice, which was obviously not based on any data. And I can't really, I actually looked a bit, and I can't really figure out why they came up with this advice to not give your kids peanuts, other than over some sort of abundance of caution, kind of like, well, if something bad happened, we'd want the kid to be older or something. And that piece of public health advice is responsible for a very large number of life-threatening allergies. Just like, that's really bad. And it's just like, that's really bad. And I think, unfortunately, a fair amount of advice that we are getting about public health is based on this sort of flawed data, or not a lot of data, or sort of data that people don't totally understand. So we can sort of celebrate when the science has kind of gone further and advanced and been been definitive. But I think we do want to be cautious, and I sort of talk about this a lot in both my academic work and my kind of outward-facing work, that just sort of being careful about the messaging that we're sending to people, and being clear on when that messaging is based on something that we really think is very convincing and when it is not, right? So you run the risk in something like this, like, for all these years, you told me don't expose my kids to peanuts, and now you're saying to expose them to peanuts. Like, do people know what you're doing at all? Right? And I think that does come up. People are like, doctors are constantly telling me different stuff. They told me this, they told me this, they told me this. Like, which thing should I believe? Why should I believe you on vaccines? You fucked up the peanuts, didn't you? And I think, that is like, we have to be careful about the kind of credibility that the sort of experts give, if we want people to actually listen to the things where it's really like, no, actually, you really should vaccinate your kid. That is really a good idea. The evidence base for that is very different than the evidence base for some of the other stuff that we're telling people to do. So I will stop there. I will say I'm very happy to answer questions about this, about my other book, about my work, about just whatever, anything you want.
Anywhere over here? I'll go to Mario over there.
I'll go there.
Oh, sorry.
You want to exercise?
Yeah.
I need my steps.
Exercise is good for you. I don't know.
We don't really know. There's very limited evidence
or
on
isn't.
that.
Thank you, Emily. That was pretty awesome. Now, what have you learned in your research about the way humans think about risk? And the reason I'm asking you this is, you know where I'm going. Yeah, sure. If I don't drink and I let the baby sleep with me, probably I'm gonna be a better, well-rested parent, and most likely I'll be a better dad or a better mom, right? But in the back of my head is that even if the chance is 1%, that the outcome is dead, so. How do what you learn about the way we balance those two things? And a caveat, I don't know what's a caveat or like a parallel issue. Like, also, like, what do you learn about the way we think about doctors and medicine in general? I have high cholesterol. I exercise. I'm not overweight. I'm okay for a 48-year-old man. I do look younger. I moisturize. So, but I take Crestor, and I tell my doctor, like, are you sure I should be taking this? Yeah. And he's like, well, that's what we're taking nowadays for high cholesterol. I was like, Yeah. So look, maybe those two things are more related than I think. So anyway.
Yeah, so I think, the question of sort of how to think about risk or how to talk about risk is something I confront a lot in the book. I think partly because when we are talking about risks of very bad outcomes, you sort of cite this idea of like co-sleeping. It's hard for people to sort of even like conceptualize the idea of risk, because of course you would sort of never take that, knowing the bad outcome, you would kind of never take that, you sort of never think to take that risk. But the thing that I try to gently help people understand in the book is, like, you are taking risks on that scale, probably without even thinking about it. And so I think this is the piece of sort of helping people understand how do these risks or other kind of risk like this sort of fit in the space of things that you are implicitly accepting every day. So the example I use often is sort of things about accidents, car accidents, other kinds of accidents, that those are risks that you are taking every day. Like, you get in a car, you get your kids in the car, people get in a car. It's pretty risky to drive. Like, car accidents are high source of death. But people don't think about, you don't think about that, like you don't sort of think about that as an option. And in some ways, maybe it isn't an option. In some ways, it kind of is an option. You could drive less, and it's not that I'm saying you should drive less, but that's a sort of way to conceptualize kind of how large is this risk relative to something which you obviously sort of must implicitly think is okay. So that's kind of one way I try to do this. I think the other thing is I try to sometimes make clear to people, like, you want to think about what the alternative is. So one of the most, I've written about this issue of co-sleeping, and one of the things that comes up is people who say basically, there is, like, I did not see a choice. This is the only way my kid would sleep. And the choice was either to sleep with them in the bed or to, like, fall asleep with them on a sofa, right? And by sort of like, which is like much, much, much substantially many times worse. And so I think we're sometimes not giving people the right information to sort of make trade-offs when they feel trapped. I think for a lot of new parents, there's particularly around sleep, it's like literally the choice is either I do this or like, I don't know, like there's no, like the thing you want me to do is impossible. Like my kid will not sleep by themselves in the crib. That is impossible. So I don't know what you want me to do. Like I have only bad outcomes, bad options, things you've told me not to do, and I can't pick which one of them I am gonna do because you've just told me they're all terrible. So I'm just gonna kind of try to do some of them. And people will write me stories like basically I was so committed to not sleeping with the kid in the bed, like I fell asleep with them in the chair and I dropped the baby. I mean, they're fine, like usually they're fine at the end of the story. But like, basically like things happen that were really much worse because I was trying to avoid this. So I would say one other thing about risk, which I think in general people just have a very hard time conceptualizing the idea of risk. And I often think about it sort of like there's only three things. There's like always, sometimes, never. And those are the only three risks we can really understand. Like some things always happen, some things never happen, everything else it's like sometimes. And so that causes us to sort of quote and understand, like you did it here. You said, like, let's say the risk is 1%. The actual risk of like a death from suffocation and sharing a bed with an adult is like distantly different from 1%. It's 0.08 in 1,000 or something like that. So it's just like way, like totally order of magnitude different from that. But you're sort of quoting that like, oh, that number seems small. Yeah, that's small, but it's not it's totally different. It's not zero, right? And so somehow you're just like, well, let me think of a small number that's not zero. Yes, sorry, I'm still thinking about your doctor question, but I don't think I can answer. It's like,
So thank you so much. Great presentation. And I'm actually really glad that the students get to see this. Two questions. One is, how important is parenting? Because I've seen like several studies about like twins separated birth in Sweden, and it seems like nature is a lot more important than nurture. Do you talk about that in book?
You mean like that just like genetics are important?
Genetics is so much more important than actually anything we can do with the kids.
So here's the thing that's, I think, complicated. A lot of the message of this book is basically like, it's kind of fine to do whatever. Like, I mean, that's not actually, many people were like, is your book just like, I paid like $14 and you're just like, yeah, do whatever you want, it's totally fine. Yeah, that's right. It was, I hope you got it for a deal. Amazon sells it for $12.87. Okay, so I think, yes, some of the message of this is like, for all of these individual choices, there are many good choices, and it's not the sort of thing that's going to make or break your kid. I think the contrast, which I think about a lot in the policy space, is actually like 0 to 3 is a really important time, and there is a tremendous amount of inequality in the resources that kids are getting, and by the time we get them into school, it's kind of already maybe not too late, but like already a lot of things have happened that are different. So the question is like, how can we sort of simultaneously say sort of none of these things matter, and yet this is a really important time? And I think part of the answer is like, the kind of resources that people have who are thinking about this like question of like, should I, like, what exactly is the right way to sleep train, and how old should I potty train my kid? Like, you're already in a space where you have a tremendous amount of resources, and so probably it's going to be fine. And I do think, I feel it's a little frustrating that actually a lot of our like debates end up being sort of between a bunch of like basically pretty elite people about things that don't matter, rather than sort of thinking about the kind of policy things that do matter. So somehow we're off here like fighting about, do you have to breastfeed your kid until they're 2, or is like 1 enough? While people have 2 weeks of paid maternity, 2 weeks of unpaid leave, and they have to go back to their job at Walmart, and like they have no childcare. That feels like that's pretty important. Whereas whether you breastfeed your kid for a year or 2 years is like not important. Sorry, I got like a little soapbox here. I'm sorry. It's just like it was like.
And the second question was about SIDS, sudden infant. Do you look at that in the book?
Yeah, I talk. I mean, I look at that sort of specifically associated with different behaviors. So sort of thinking about like what does the evidence say on the sort of links with co-sleeping or with breastfeeding and these different things. Yeah. Hi.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm a pregnant person and a doula, so you're like
Congratulations.
birth queen right now. I'm just very happy. And my husband's a finance professor here, so
Oh my God, this is like living the dream. Okay.
Yeah, so it's like best of both worlds. Anyway, sorry. I read both of your books before doing a lactation course, a week-long CLC class. It was great, but I heard a lot of like misinformation,
Yeah.
like if you don't breastfeed your baby, your kid will end up really fat forever. And yeah, it was a lot of like, just, oh yeah. So, but I'm not like a Twitter person, but I heard you got some like backlash from lactivists on Twitter. For American,
Yeah. Oh yeah.
lactivist.
100%.
For the record,
That's
I
a
am
word.
not a lactivist,
That's a word.
but
Yep. That's a word.
I'm the least crunchy doula in the world. But how do you deal with lactivists and who have not read your book, and how do you encourage them to look at the data?
Yeah. So I mean, I have found that when people hold their beliefs very strongly, encouraging them to look at the data is not very helpful because they will there is a sort of subtlety to talking about some of like what does the evidence say, what does the evidence not say, where people are just like, well, what about this paper? And then you're like, do I literally have to, like, there are 1,000 papers. Like, we're gonna have a Twitter thing where I would be like, no, that paper's not good for this. No, that paper's not good for this. So I try not to I find that those engagements are not super helpful. I think the most extreme thing that happened is somebody wrote a profile of me and they interviewed the person who's like the doctor who's like the main she would not refer to herself as a lactivist, but she's the main lactivist for the AAP. She has like an official position of the breastfeeding lady in the AAP. And she said basically having this person who is an economist like interpret these like studies about health like is as bad as that this is as bad as the anti-vaxxers. Which was like a pretty extreme thing. I thought it was like a pretty extreme, like weird thing to say. I mean, I may not be an epidemiologist, but I'm like a person who writes statistics paper. I'm like, that's like my job, And so it was, and I also think the idea that somehow telling people that her claim was like, well, what about this evidence that breastfeeding prevents Crohn's disease, which is like, first of all, terrible evidence, but also it's like somehow the difference between sort of saying that vaccines are bad and like not acknowledging some weak evidence about the links with Crohn's, those seem like pretty different things. So I try not to engage I try not to engage too much. With these, you can't get with people. And actually the guy who's the head of the AAP had to apologize for her statement. Just saying. He didn't say that he agreed with me, but he did say that it was not, it was an unfortunate comparison to the anti-vaxxers. Unfortunate.
I was wondering if you could discuss if by any feedback mechanisms you have both, online or in person, behavior change and kind of what drives behavior change based upon what you've seen from your audiences and other folks. I mean, clearly, like, I will read your book, I'll interpret the data, and I'll think, like, great. But talking with my wife about how we raise, kids, like, she goes much more by, like, anecdotes and kind of what family's done, kind of, like, passed down from generations.
Yeah.
So, like, saying a compelling story to her might change her behaviors where I just want to see the data.
Yeah.
Just kind of what you've seen.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the spaces that I think about, I think behavior change is actually hard. So behavior change, I think is hard. So I mean, I think a lot of my research work is on diet, and one of the things that comes out there is just like you cannot get people to change their diet. That's like impossible, very hard to do. In this space, I think there's a good opportunity to change sort of what populations are doing in shorter times because you get a sort of re-up every time somebody has it, right? So there's a lot of choices that you're gonna make which you haven't made before, and so you're going to there's no change, there's a change from some previous generation, but not a change from the thing that you that you have done before. But I think there's an interesting question about messaging and like what is the right messaging to influence people's behavior. And the place I've thought about this most is in vaccines, where I think there is like a really compelling reason to want to try to influence people's behavior. And I think there is this huge disconnect between the sort of kind of messaging that the kind of pro-vaccine side is doing, which a lot of which is surrounding data and evidence and kind of like vaccines are safe and effective and let me show you some numbers. And a lot of the messaging on the other side, some of which is sort of like that, but much of which is in this like, well, let me tell you this anecdote about this thing that happened. My kid had a vaccine and then a few days later this thing happened. And like, I think people find that that kind of evidence is very compelling. To everybody. I mean, I think we often have to like turn that piece off a little bit when we're trying to listen to listen to data. So I think it's not. There's this sort of experimental question of like how can we just like find better evidence. But I think in my own, when I sort of think about the places where my husband and I differ on kind of how we will make these choices, in some ways like the biggest thing is just like to sort of be deliberate about how we make the choices, particularly in these kind of early, where it's like basically probably like different things are fine. I think part of what is hard is if you think one thing because of one piece of evidence and she thinks another thing because of another piece of evidence. So it's sort of like how do you kind of come together? I don't know.
Find a better system for this.
You're really getting to respect.
Yeah.
Are there any parenting studies done on twins separated at birth?
Sure, but I think parenting stuff like that would be in this space probably not so much. There's a lot of twin studies, although mostly they're about twins who are not separated at birth, and there are some sort of sibling studies like from adoptees where you can sort of see adoptees in different settings. But I don't think that is not a major source of evidence on these things.
All right, so I'll ask the two final questions. So what you mentioned this for a second on how evidence gets to people, right? And I think today earlier on you talked to us about some evidence associated with the taking of supplements, vitamin E, for example,
Yeah.
and how a study showed up in the New York Times, the front page, and that is very influential, right? Something like that. And typically those studies, whenever it's reported on a news source like the New York Times or some reputable source like that, is written by people that don't understand how to think about these issues the way you can think about, the way we try to teach our students, perhaps at a graduate level, but that's not something that journalists typically think about. Do you have any, have you thought about this notion of what can we do as a profession to try to perhaps improve the way journalism it's done, how those headlines, because if it bleeds, it leads, right? That's the problem that we face here. Is there any hope on that dimension to be more thoughtful journalism really available?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is this thing you said, like we try to teach our graduate students. Like I find it I think it's unfortunate that the people you're trying to teach are your graduate students.
My undergraduates are here; they're freshmen.
Right, exactly.
I think
we got to go we got to go below that in a sense. That I think when I think about the kinds of math or like things that we're teaching in high school, I sort of wonder where's the space for statistics and statistical reasoning in high school. Not that I think we shouldn't teach people trigonometry, but I would just notice that the statistics comes up a lot more frequently than trigonometry, and so we might. So I think there is more of a just need for people to be literate in these spaces, and I do think there's a little bit more push now for people to be a little bit more critical. So if I think about how people process the latest studies about running, any amount of running causes you to live for 30% longer or something, you see a little bit more of a space of but I think it is hard to read those. It is hard to process those, and I think part of it is honestly the fault of the people writing the papers, who are not always super honest about how causal their stuff is, and so maybe if they were better, then the journalists wouldn't have this hard
That's
job.
my last question then. So you mentioned that the studies that say the experts say this today and they say that tomorrow, and they're not really being super honest and as good about portraying that evidence. Are economists better?
No, probably not, right? I mean, I think some pieces of what we say are, look, everybody wants to tell a story. I think our empirical methods are better. Whether that means we are more honest about their limitations, I think that's probably too extreme.
Anybody else? Well, let's thank Emily.
Thank you.